Hi, everyone, and welcome to the October 25th JupyterLab weekly meeting. It looks like we have 13 people on the call right now. And you can find a link to the agenda in the chat. Thank you, Jason W., for posting it again. And please sign in if you're inclined. It looks like not that many of us were inclined today. I will sign in. And please add your name and items you'd like to talk about in the agenda. And yeah, why don't we get started? So today at the top of the agenda, we have Mike talking about a topic that I am very interested in as well. So please take the floor, Mike.
All right. So I will share my screen. There's always a little bit of suspense when sharing screen on Zoom because it can crash my laptop. And I think it worked. So JupyterLab 3 had two separate behaviors for scrolling, which depended on whether you were executing with Shift and Enter or navigating with arrow down, arrow up. When executing with Shift and Enter, a cell which was partially overlapping, partially visible, stayed in the view, and that was regardless of whether it was a long cell which would fit in the which wouldn't fit in the viewport, or a short cell which would. With navigation using arrows in command mode, the cell which was long would align with the top of the viewport, and a short cell which would fit in the viewport would align to the bottom. With the windowed notebook, all of that behavior had to be re-implemented, and we didn't catch this stability when the windowed implementation was being drafted and then during the review. So what followed were certain improvements which were added. For example, there is this idea that if a cell is short, so it is smaller than the viewport height, it could be centered when it is being scrolled to using a table of contents. And the code base that is responsible for determining where how a given cell should be aligned is actually shared between all these three cases. So navigation, table of contents, and alignment after execution of a cell. But it has quite a few arguments. One of those is smart, auto, and a lot of different modes. So the question is whether we should preserve the behavior from JupyterLab 3, potentially improving it, so that there are two different behaviors depending on what you are doing, with the presumption that we would be conservative and try to avoid distracting user with any scrolling when they just executed and advanced to the next cell. And then if they are navigating, they possibly might want to see more or adjust their view if they are crossing the viewport boundary. Or should we do something else? And in particular, here there is a comparison of trade-offs. Go on. Okay. Here is a comparison of of different proposals. So before action, before executing, this cell could be partially visible aligned to the bottom, or could stay as it was, and a long cell could either be aligned to the top or stay partially visible. So yeah, my question is, are there any preferences on whether we should preserve the old behavior, adjust it, and if you are interested in more details, what we are actually implementing right now, there is a possibility of having some margin defined, and the integrity are that if a cell is only visible, like 3 pixels of a cell are visible, we probably should still scroll to it. But then the question is how we define the margin. What does it mean of a cell to be marginally visible or not visible enough that we want to scroll anyways? And one of the proposals to solve that is to define a margin not based off a percentage of the viewport or the cell, but as a fixed size, for example, a height of a single smallest possible cell. So yeah, any thoughts on that?
If we had a behavior we shipped and I'm sorry, Fred, what was that?
Sorry, Afshin.
Oh, okay. If we had a behavior that we shipped in 3.x and we modified it, can you think of a good argument for not changing it back, basically? Right, it seems like if we shipped something, people got somewhat used to it. At the very least, we shouldn't arbitrarily modify it, and it seems like we have. So what's the argument for modifying it, I guess, is what I'm asking. Let me take that back. What's the argument for not re-implementing the old behavior as you're proposing is what I'm asking. Like, I don't know the counter argument really, so I would be curious to hear that. Because to me, it seems like, yeah, you should stay consistent with the behavior.
I tend to agree. One argument that I think that Frederick was raising was that this behavior was not consistent between the two actions. And maybe, as I was earlier, before discovering that there are two different behaviors in 3.x, I was proposing that maybe we want to always keep the cell visible to avoid distractions at all costs. But now, after some more thought, I see that users might be more familiar with two different behaviors depending on the action they intend to take, and that maybe there is a case for having two different behaviors. And of course, there is this trivial argument of having a simpler code base if we only implement one, but it's not a strong one.
We could, I mean, depending on how easy this is to set up, we could potentially do some user research and not try to arrive at this, with argumentation and platonic ideals, and we might just see. But I don't know if we have the capacity or capability to do that. But when it comes to things like this scrolling stuff, because we're such every one of us is like the sort of the people who do implementing is like an atypical user in so many ways. Like we don't, it would be good if we could kind of know what people are expecting here, but I don't know if currently we can. Do you know?
Well, they certainly complain about the current behavior, which is neither of what was proposed.
Sure.
But yeah, of course, the purpose of discussing that was to check whether there are any strong opinions, and if there are no strong opinions, I think that the safe course is to revert to what was in 3.x and then we can open an issue to follow up with review of the behavior that we had.
That seems, yeah, I mean, okay, so as a group, everyone on this call, any objections to this plan?
Yeah. Yeah. The old behavior for me is kind of weird with this difference of behavior, to be honest. Because it's even not consistent depending if the cell is small or not small. Like the PR mic is proposing saying, okay, let's try to scroll as not scroll as much as possible. It's better that way probably. It's maybe better than the behavior that was before. Because the behavior of before was also using some heuristic, okay, I need to scroll a bit and to feel like a quarter of the viewport, but it depends on the size of the cell. And so, yeah, I don't think, I'm not sure it's worth having something so complex that, yeah, some users may like or others may not like. And I think something simpler and more consistent is probably better.
I can throw in some accessibility angles if people are interested. I'm not sure which behaviors are which. I'm just going to talk about what WCAG would say here. So if you execute and you scroll, a user might prefer reduced motion, and that would be a violation. So if something is moving, playing, or scrolling, you need to be able to pause or stop it, right? So that would be what would make an accessible solution that scrolls to the output. The simplest solution would be kind of not to do anything. And in my experience, cells without outputs are likely an accessibility violation. And they might even be able to be replaced with some other kind of like blank element or something like that. But it's hard to, with a screen reader, to audibly know when you've transitioned into a cell if you don't have an output, regardless of how small it is. So I think that there's something to announcing outputs and having like a null output, but then also the complexity of being able to pause the scrolling for reduced motion circumstances. Those would be the big ones that I would see playing a role in this.
Does output just need to be in the DOM or does it need to be visible? You're on mute, I think.
I can never find Zoom when it goes away. So like the simplest thing, so like let's say you had a really long notebook and you're like looking at cells 10 to 20. You could say cell 90 has 2 outputs. Cell 91 has 0 outputs without putting that in there. So there are some visual things, but there are also some like higher level statistical things that might say. So you might go, entering cell 1 in 1, entering or exiting cell 1 in 1, entering out 1, 0 outputs. And that would let the screen reader know that. So there kind of could be like a blank non-visual sort of thing there that helps, that we're kind of missing. But some of this stuff would have to be in the DOM. If it needed to be visual, then it would have to be in the DOM, but you could probably slice off some aggregates and put those in the DOM and also elevate that to assistive tech. I think your mic's off, Darren.
Thanks. Just putting it in and not making it visible is low-hanging fruit, right? So like that's a good first pass and seeing if it actually does improve. But you also had a comment in the chat about configurability of this behavior. I think that should come in the phase where we are trying to figure out what are good behaviors here. But I think Mike's proposal is basically, we already shipped 2 different behaviors. Let's ship just one behavior. So I think.
But y'all suggested user testing, right? And right now we really don't have bandwidth to do targeted user testing. We do have bandwidth for is like putting configurations in there and finding out what the users might prefer. So this is another accessibility angle here. Like, since we don't have active user testing, configurability is another thing that makes this more accessible and helps us figure it out, right? So if it's not too much, since we have both of the behaviors, how hard would it be to implement both of them versus like have this conversation about what's the best one, and maybe we could have a scroll to behavior, a no scroll behavior, some kinds of things like that.
Yeah, that's something Mike can answer.
So there are two questions. One question is, do we want to preserve the dual behavior depending on whether it's navigation using arrow keys versus execution and advancing to the next cell? And the second question is, if we have the two behaviors, do we want them to be configurable? And I see a very strong case for having this prefers reduced motion ability. And also I do personally see a use case of having a navigation which reveals more of the cell than execution and advancement. So I think that, and all of these things are kind of doable, so they are not that much of a maintenance burden because we already accept these 4 configuration options, and could add another one which would be indicating that the user prefers reduced motion or to avoid scrolling as much as possible or not. And then the exact behavior might not be matching 3.x in all the circumstances, but it broadly should be similar and then potentially better because it would be configurable. So I think I will take it from there, and if anyone has more thoughts, we can discuss that on the pull request or on the issue.
Yeah, I don't think you have that 2 keystroke, but that 2 event sort of difference there. I think folks might prefer one or the other, probably, and I'm curious if that's what we're actually testing.
Okay, I think we can move on for now. Thanks, everyone. Next up today is Jason W.
Hey everyone, am I unmuted? Yeah, I am. So 2 things. One, next week is my second least favorite week of the year because Europe has changed its clocks, but the US largely has not. So all of our European friends, your calendars are going to be an hour off because most of our meetings are indexed to US Pacific time. The following week, everything will revert to normal because the US and Europe will be on winter time. So thanks for your patience next week. The other question, which has already been answered, but I'll say that, yeah, Mike, we can debate who's right and wrong. Really, we should just be using UTC for everything and having our meetings, at 2 in the morning. But the other topic is the JupyterLab Git release, which I see Frederick has already replied to. We're looking for a JupyterLab release for Jupyter, or JupyterLab Git release for JupyterLab 4. Frederick says that there's an alpha version out. I was talking about this with my team yesterday, and someone noticed that the continuous integration is not yet working. Is that related to the NB dime being unavailable, Frederick?
Right now it's great.
Oh, right now it's green? Okay. That may have been accurate as of the moment that
yeah, that's
flagged to the team.
okay. I don't want to throw any stone to anybody, but right now, since this morning, it's green.
Okay, good. Excellent.
So there were 2 issues, one which I opened, and that is that it's not working on Binder when real-time collaboration is enabled, because I was trying that out just before this meeting to share a Binder with you. There's a link in the chat, and you will see that because of a drive path issue. There is something which is not clicking on. I don't know what's that. And the other is that if you install the pre-release of JupyterLab Kit, all your commit messages will be the same because of a variable which is overridden, which is an edge case where TypeScript didn't catch a variable being overridden in a child scope. So it's kind of a pretty serious but also possibly funny error. Unfortunately, it got caught very quickly in the pre-release. So yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, thank you, Jason. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everyone. That's all I got.
Great. All right. So, Jeremy, you are up.
So I just wanted to share two issues. So on the notes for this meeting, and they are about this feature we have in JupyterLab called drives. So with drives, you can add an extra file browser to the left panel usually, and load content from other sources. So, for example, from remote servers or even from your local file system. Really depends on how they are implemented, and they are quite useful, at least for browsing content. But they have quite a few limitations, especially if you want to make the kernel aware of the files from a drive. So at the moment, there is no real way to do this. And these issues, they already have a few comments in there. They so it would be useful to start to think about that a bit more, maybe for the next feature release, if we can do some improvements in a non-breaking way, or maybe for JupyterLab 5, trying to find a way to improve this feature, which is quite useful and also easy to implement because it's just a JupyterLab extension in the end that can add content just from the front end, which is quite handy. But yeah, there are quite a few things missing to make both the UX and also the experience for extension authors a bit better. So that's why I just wanted to share those two here. We can discuss now or at a later time. That's what I have. Yeah.
Given that Fred's bullet point is just a PSA and we're only 28 minutes in, now would be a good time to talk about this if there are people who are interested in talking about it. So I think based on what the last thing that Jeremy said, Mike's question, is this a JEP level question? I think the answer is probably not if it's possible to do entirely as a JupyterLab extension, but I'm curious to hear the argument the other way.
Well, if it involves adding a new message to the kernel to make it aware of the files, I just don't quite see how it would work. Maybe that's not a message, maybe that's not a new API for the kernel, but the kernel has, in a language agnostic way, learn about the remote file system, as I understand the proposal. And that sounds like a universal API that would ultimately need to be adapted by all the kernels if we want to allow them to do that. I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, I guess so the kernel will definitely need to know something about this content, which is only available on the front end. And I guess it could be made optional for sure. Or maybe that means rethinking the contents API to also add, I think there's an issue about that. Maybe you open it, Mike, like adding a extra source of contents. But but the number of use cases is quite high, because you could have like a kernel running somewhere else, like completely like in different machine, but then the contents on S3, and you would want this kernel to know about the files on an S3 bucket. At the moment, if you use drives in lab and you start creating a notebook, starting a kernel, it's going to pick up the files from the default contents API. It works with RTC because RTC, I think, knows about those files as well. They kind of bypasses the contents API, so it's kind of a special case in a way. But even though it's using a drive to implement the feature, so I guess a good point would be to start looking at what we would like to achieve. So yeah, like the case of remote kernels, but this all also came from the case of Jupyter Lite. So like light kernels, since there is no server, a convenient way for a Jupyter Lite deployment to add extra source of content is to do it via drive, because then someone making an extension, they can easily load files from somewhere else. But then this is not very useful if the kernel is not able to access the files. So it's useful in a way for browsing files, but not for accessing them. And in case of Lite, you could easily have, I think, a way to to just make it work in Jupyter Lite, because everything is in the browser, so it's much more controlled environment.
So
But
if you're adding an extra drive, which is an S3
Sorry,
bucket, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt you, Eric. Mike had his hand up. I just didn't say anything before.
Oh,
Apologies for that.
Sorry.
Oh, all right, sorry.
No, I'm really sorry. That was my bad.
So my thinking about that is maybe having a more concrete proposal of how that could be implemented could help everyone understand what and how we are trying to achieve. And from my understanding, please correct me if it's wrong, is that it could be either implemented as just a dump of JSON saying the kernel and that these drives, and you need to call this API URL with these authentication details, which is tricky, but you can access them. So that's one solution. The other solution would be server knows about these things and has access to the kernel environment, so it can create a symbolic link, and then the kernel can now access as if it was on the drive. Or maybe it's not a symbolic link, maybe it's a virtual drive in the memory, but that's still a kind of second solution. And the third solution that I see is having an API which can proxy all file-related requests, which involves re-implementing all the OS-like file handling behaviors in a specific language and proxying them for the Jupyter server API. So these are like the three possible implementations that I see. And I'm not sure whether we are proposing any specific one or are thinking about one, or are you just exploring ways to get this working independent of implementation?
yeah, I don't think there is no suggestion for a solution yet, because the number of use cases is quite big. If we look at the whole JupyterLab deployment scenario, but this came up recently because of a change in JupyterLab 4 when it comes to the prefix in the path. So before, the session context was aware of the drive in a way, because the drive name was part of the path as a prefix, and that means that the API calls to server also knew about the drive in a way, because this ended up, as one of the in the payload, for example, when starting a new session. But this information is lost now in JupyterLab 4 because the session context does not know about the drive anymore. But that's why. So it's kind of like the start of this discussion is we had that before. It was not documented. It was not official. There was no like real kind of structure or like documentation on telling people this is how you do it. But it was somehow possible, a bit clunky. And that's what JupyterLab used to let the kernels know about this. And in terms of solution, the one implemented in JupyterLab at the moment is something like I think the first one you were talking about, using an API that is just accepting requests and then looking at the drive name in there and then forwarding that to the contents API, the contents manager of JupyterLab, to do the proper calls for saving on this drive or on this drive. And there is indeed a virtual file system involved, the one from Emscripten. And re-implementing something like that so that it works in all kernels or even just the API kernel would be, I don't know, sounds very complicated, but I don't know if there would be a better way to do it, for sure. Yeah. And you can open files from different sources, like also databases, like a connection to the database. So it, yeah. So the conclusion on that is like for the solution that will work in a generic way, I'm not sure, but maybe there should be just a small like extension points or just a very small API surface to allow that like multiple use cases using drives. Yeah, and in that case, maybe it does require indeed a JEP or something that because it spans across multiple components of the Jupyter stacks.
Just trying to imagine a multi-kernel solution that doesn't require the kernel to know anything about the server that launched it or the client or anything like that. All I could imagine was a 0MQ based file system and a bunch of new messages, as I think Mike's original question was, where you can basically have any kernel opt into, I support 0MQ file systeming, right? And then whoever launched the kernel is then responsible for also kind of listening on the same 0MQ channels and responding to like file server type requests. That way it could be opt-in, anyone could do it. It wouldn't require any change in, like, you don't add any new concepts, but it's like a whole giant API. So like, it's a big change, but it's the kind of big change that's like opt-in, and I don't know. That's the only thing I could imagine, but I haven't thought about this problem as long as everyone else has.
But the tricky thing with file systems is, yeah, I mean, it's not just about listing files or getting the content of a file all at once. Sometimes you want to open, like, if you take all of the Python libraries, you open the seek at the given position, and there's also like binary files. There are way too many assumptions made on on the type of file system being used by a kernel, which is why it's tricky to kind of abstract that with an API from the start. Also, maybe that's why also use cases can help here, because that gives a bit more content on how this is supposed to be used.
Yeah, I mean, I did a quick search, but like not endorsing anyone. My default browser is DuckDuckGo, so I don't trust these results quite. But you know, at least I saw one attempted project of add an FS, a file system over 0MQ, right? That makes me think maybe there are potentially some standards around serving a file system over something like this. If that existed as a standard, maybe we say, okay, kernels support the ZMQFS standard or something. But like, if that doesn't, yeah, we basically have a complex problem with a lot of moving parts, and we've resisted for like whatever it is, 15, 20 years now, giving the kernel too much knowledge about where it comes from, what its client is, and all that. How long can we maintain that? If there's a way to maintain that, it'll probably be an easier thing to sell, because there are a lot of kernels out there, right? Yeah, Nick.
I mean, every time one of these things comes up, it's like give people something they can do over the COM bus or specifically over the widget bus, because that is a thing that we can already play rather strongly to. So we could, we could preview this with JupyterLab, and make it like a little context manager. With Contents Manager open, now you get this local file handle. It does some nonsense for you and be like, yeah, this is a pattern that you could implement that's using the browser side Jupyter clients model. Because as soon as you get out of this iDrive is a thing that's managed by Lab, now you'd have to not only implement it in Lab, you'd have to implement it somewhere else. And I think in some of the cases where people are doing this, like the iRods one, that's exactly the thing, right? The kernel has the iRods client, or the person that's deployed the kernel has used the fuse layer to expose iRods as a backend. So they see that transparently, but you can't win file systems, right? Like it's incredibly brutal. And most of the solutions don't work on Windows. Certainly not in a OneDrive inside of a, Linux subsystem, whatever, Weasel. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot missing. Well, basically, it really seems as though the kind of API we have to give people has to allow for streaming, has to be asynchronous, has to be something that's not blocking, and also has to be implicitly remote, which means you can't use it for anything that, say, requires locking, I imagine. Like, I just don't see how we're going to have a cross-platform, cross-kernel solution to accessing multiple contents worth of drives if it isn't something that can basically be served over the channels, because everything else seems like it just, like, even if we add endpoints and they're well-known endpoints, we now have to give a mechanism for every kernel to discover those endpoints or something. Like everything comes with a cost that is a change in the assumptions, except either take one of the current channels, as Nick says, or some other mechanism and like serve things on that layer. But that's a big undertaking. It'll probably be slower for most code that users currently write, because they're used to writing like talk to my current file system, so they might be annoyed. If it's streaming and we're not using some battle hardened library, if we roll our own, we will make tons of mistakes, and so there's a lot of difficulty here. But like, I don't know. I mean, it's universally the case that people want to talk, do something about files, right? Inside their notebook code. And they want also to have the other characteristics of what kernels do. So like we kind of have to keep those assumptions. Yeah, that's right. I mean, but what the sort of direction I'm going, like, takes that to the absurd. Like, all of it is just streams on 0MQ, right? Like I kind of want to take basically a REST file system API that's fairly minimal, only gives you certain capacity to do things, which are the kinds of things you can imagine somebody doing in a notebook. We don't have to give them crazy system level. Do we have other things on the agenda other than Fred's PSA? You're because of the time check. No, we're good. So
No, I don't have anything to discuss. I just wanted to make everyone aware.
yeah. Maybe if we spend long enough on this subject, people will turn on the cameras and start talking. That's actually been my whole. That's been my secret plan.
Yeah, I tried to do a bit of research and see and try to learn more about why the drives were created in JupyterLab in the first place. So I think they've been there for such a long time. But I'm wondering.
I remember why. It had to do with. I think it had to do with our attempt at RTC using the Google Real-Time API. Also came with the concept of drives.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
Yep. So Ian put that together and did the wise thing of not making it Google this and Google that, right? Like there was an interface that the Google one could implement, and then they shut it off so it didn't work anymore. But yeah, so it was meant to support synced content that was evented and fine-grained, and I believe could be commented on, although maybe only the Google one did that. But it had out-of-band junk like that.
Okay, so maybe we should let this subject stew in people's minds, but it's a big one. And maybe we can return to it. But and also there's those two issues, so please participate there. Yeah, I mean, right.
Yeah, I mean, at least for now, there are at least a couple of things we can try. And I know especially experiment with. So yeah, like Nick suggested, maybe making that driving that in like JupyterLab as a widget, or looking at how it's gonna be with JupyterLite when everything is in the same browser environment, and then trying to see if there is a way we can port some of these ideas, or at least make them configurable, or whether it makes sense for like other extensions, more general JupyterLab extensions to have. Yeah, but a lot of I think it's still a lot of experiments to do first.
Cool.
Because
Okay.
unfortunately, the drive were, although they were there since the beginning, they were not used. Like lots of issues start to be highlighted by RTC as the first one to set the drive. Like might discover another one, the Git extension. I guess other extension have experienced that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like maybe iDrive is more what the pattern should be like for like settings. I don't know. Yes, having it more dog-fooded directly would keep these kinds of breakages from occurring. So, but I don't know what that would look like. Like anything that's not full rewritable contents and is not on the RTC bus because it doesn't make any friggin' sense should maybe be an iDrive. And then we are not writing a bunch of bespoke REST endpoints and extra WebSockets and all those kinds of things that they're working.
Yeah, and more generally, this is also an interesting discussion because it's also the kind of what direction and documentation we want to provide people with. Like to answer questions like how do I add more content to my lab deployment, like what should be the best practices, like, and if we want to tend towards this drive approach, then yeah, I mean all of these limitations we've been talking about, they will have to be addressed at some point. But again, it's really based on use cases and how people deploy Jupyter.
Okay.
So you could probably, I guess, do early experiments entirely as extensions and plugins, right? Because what I wonder then is like if you provide some kind of built-in extension, maybe there's tokens for different types of file systems. So like you could provide a sort of de facto standard via a plugin or like a provider, and then you could have you could have different, like you could have an S3 provider, for instance, right? Like that could hook into this built-in plugin that says I provide for S3 buckets. Just a thought. But I'm guessing you could probably get something up and running, at least on a demo basis, that way.
I wonder how hard it would be to do what Mike proposes, because if we supported a web API standard, that would be awesome. But I imagine we're probably quite far from that. Like it's not a one-to-one translation for sure, but it is quite attractive to adopt a standard like this.
You mean a plugin based one or extension based?
No, I'm sorry. I was responding to the link in the chat that Mike
I see.
put. Yeah. But the plugin way of doing it, I do also agree with that orthogonally to this.
Kind of avoids all of the difficulties of making new standards at different levels.
Yeah.
Do we have any other plugins that are de facto standards that people implement new providers for?
I mean, people build on top of the widgets all the time because the widgets are a protocol, and widgets aren't exactly extensions. They're a different thing, but they're different plugin point in Jupyter that uses a known standard, and you can build arbitrary APIs with.
Yeah.
Okay. Fred, you are up.
Yeah, just a short announcement so that the list of the members have been updated on the JupyterLab console repository, and everybody that's member of the console should have received a GitHub notification with a new issue that has a bunch of checkbox. So every members need to check the box on the group they want to be part of. We have 3 weeks for answering that membership check, and after that we'll update the team accordingly. There is one point that we probably need discussion with this first membership check, is that we have more people with the admin role that what we decide we will have. So we decided that the number of people with the highest rights will be limited to 7 people, and currently we have already 11, I think. So we're gonna need to have some discussion who keeps the admin rights. And that's it.
Okay, cool, thanks. So how often do they trigger?
Twice a year.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Thanks for working on this. Any questions, anyone, comments? All right. And Mike, you have a PSA and 2 bullet points.
Yes, so basically 3 PSAs. One, in 1 week's time, on 1st of November, we have feature freeze of JupyterLab 4.1. So any pull request which is ready for review, we'll try to review that and merge into 4.1 if we agree for that. Otherwise, it goes into the next going through this. And I added on the top of the meeting notes links to 3 lists of pull requests or issues. So there are issues with pull requests which need review, and if you have time, helping the review would be appreciated. We currently have 91 pull requests, and not all of them are ready for review. Not all of them have the label needs review, which indicates that the author has been waiting a little while and wanted to attract attention to it. And then there are issues which I just wanted to highlight. If you do not subscribe, do not attend the triage meeting, you might have missed some of the interesting discussions and design ideas. In particular, there are issues which are labeled needs design and needs discussion. There are 112 issues which need discussion and 10 issues which need design. If you're interested in what the future versions of JupyterLab will look like, that's probably worth a perusal. That's all from me.
Okay, thanks, Mike. All right, I am going to stop recording in case anyone wants to say anything off the record. So brace yourselves.